Guillermo del Toro, one of the most successful filmmakers out there right now, his dream project is to make a book called At the Mountains of Madness. How many of you have ever heard of H.P. Lovecraft? H.P. Lovecraft is the greatest American writer of horror fiction between Edgar Allan Poe and Stephen King. There have been many, many films made and television episodes made based on Lovecraft's stories. There's never been a decent movie. There have been a lot of movies, but not a real movie. And his best book, although he was a better short story writer, his best book is At the Mountains of Madness. Del Toro can't get it made. He just cannot get the money. And if Del Toro, people like Morgan Freeman and Guillermo del Toro can't get stuff like this made. At the Mountains of Madness is as much science fiction as it is horror, really. It would fit if there was such a genre in the genre of Alien, which would be science fiction horror. It would be a brilliant film, and I'm sure Del Toro would do wonderful with it. I want to see it. But
perhaps we can get Peter Jackson interested.
Well, it's enough. If Peter Jackson wants to make it, it'll get made. But if Del Toro can't get it made, yes.
What do you think about the Star Wars prequels? And do you think there was a change in the creative process compared to the original trilogy?
I think George wants to make small experimental movies. Fans and friends and who knows, to make those films. He wanted to tell his version of Darth Vader's story. And I wasn't crazy about it. Nobody was crazy about it. The last one, episode 3, is the best, and he kind of redeemed himself with that. Part of the reason I have problems with that is, not necessarily George, but a very good friend of mine named James Gurney, an artist, did a series of children's books, young adult books called Dinotopia, which actually was made into a television miniseries by Hallmark. Unfortunately, they got the Halmy father and son team involved, and they destroy everything they touch. They did Wizard of Earthsea, Ursula Le Guin book, and they destroyed that. They destroy everything they touch, because they know better. Anyway, they did Dinotopia. And there are a couple of scenes in the Dinotopia books that are in the first episode 1 of Star Wars, which are direct lifts from Jim's work. And I spoke to Jim about it. A lot of people spoke to Jim about it. And Jim is one of the most laid-back, easygoing guys you'd ever want to know. And he told me what happened with that, and I still wasn't happy with it. I said, you really need to do something about this. And he doesn't want. It's kind of like me. I came to Prescott to write my books because nobody would bother me. Jim doesn't want anybody to bother him. And so I have other reasons for not liking the prequels.
Time for one more question.
Okay. Who hasn't asked a question yet? Okay.
You mentioned that you came to the attention of the George Lucas for Star Wars because of Ice Rigger, and some other novelizations that you did. What were the novelizations that you'd done already at that point?
They were Star Trek logs.
They were Star Trek logs?
Yeah, the 10 Star Trek logs, the novelization of John Carpenter's first film. You all know John Carpenter's first film? You all know John Carpenter.
Yeah.
John Carpenter's first film was a film called Dark Star, which was his and Dan O'Bannon, who later went on to write Blue Thunder and Alien. It was his and Dan O'Bannon's graduate student film project at USC. If you're in the graduate film program at a major university, you make a film. Well, they made this little student film called Dark Star, which ended up costing about 30 grand. This is back in the early 70s, remember. They were just borrowing money from everybody. And what they wanted to do more than anything else was get a theatrical release of their student film. Not for money, but if you get the theatrical release, then as the director, you're qualified to join the Directors Guild. As a writer, you're qualified to join the Writers Guild. These are big things in Hollywood. You're already a member of the Guild. It's a tremendous in. So they tried to sell the film all over Hollywood. Nobody would touch it until they ran into the guy who released The Blob, one of the great schlock producers in the history of Hollywood. I forget the guy's name. I used to know it all the time. But he added some professional credits, and they cleaned up the soundtrack and cleaned up the color somewhat. And they released this student film, and now it's kind of a cult hit. And I did the book version of that. And I remember sitting with John Carpenter at the Hamburger Hamlet restaurant across the street from Grauman's Chinese Theater on Hollywood Boulevard, late at night after having seen the film, which I was able to do before I wrote the book, with him talking about how he wanted to be a director and me talking about how I wanted to be a writer. And lo and behold, Dan O'Bannon, the writer that I was talking about, plays one of the main characters in the film. And you can actually see a few of the seeds of Alien in Dark Star, there's a battle with an alien, a beach ball with feet. I actually call it the beach ball in the book. I couldn't think of a clever name for this beach ball-looking alien, so I just call it the beach ball. But for a student film back in the 70s, it's very impressive. There's a neat little spaceship in there that was built by Greg Jean, who later went on to build the mothership in Close Encounters. Some of the backgrounds were painted by a man named Ron Cobb, who became a major set designer, did all of the sets for Conan, the Schwarzenegger Conan film. You read those credits on this student film, it's very impressive. So that's the story. So those were the novelizations I had done, and there were a couple of other things before Star Wars.
Were novelizations something you thought you would get into?
No.
No. It was...
People say, how do I do novelizations? How do I get to do this? I said, I don't know. It just happened. The way it happened, and then I'll finish up, I had done 3 original novels for Del Rey. Judy Lynn had come in to take over editorship of the science fiction line from Betty Ballantyne, who's still around, by the way, a remarkable lady. And someone at Ballantyne had bought the rights to do a book version of a really terrible Italian movie called Luana. It's basically a female Tarzan movie. And Judy Lynn said, we have the rights to this. I don't know what to do with it. She knew that I had a degree in film. She said, can you try to make a book out of it? So I said, sure. I said, send me the screenplay. She said, well, there is no screenplay. I said, but we'll set up a screening for you in Los Angeles, where I was still living at the time. So I went into this little office, people who had bought the American distribution rights for the film, and they had a little screening room, and I watched the film, which was all in Italian with no subtitles. So all I knew was I was watching a really, really bad film, a film that embodied all the worst aspects of Italian film. It was supposed to be a female Tarzan story. You know, the people from Italy go and find a female Tarzan living in the jungle. The female Tarzan is played by this little Vietnamese refugee who's about 5 feet tall. She's only in the film for about 15 minutes anyway. The rest of it is all the people tramping through the jungle and having various bad adventures. They all have terrible hair color and style. It's just awful. So I'm thinking, well, what can I do with this? I've already committed to try and make a book out of this. The young publicity director for the American distributor was a fan, science fiction fan, and he had hired Frank Frazetta to do the advertising art for the movie. They got 2 paintings out of Frazetta. Well, Del Rey got permission to use the paintings on the front and back cover of the book. Well, this is, for those of you who know the work of Frank Frazetta doesn't paint slim little 5-foot-tall Vietnamese refugees. He had this real female Tarzan on the cover with a tiger on one side, Black Panther on one side and a lion on the other side. Typical dynamic Frazetta painting. So I novelized the cover. And that's why the book is dedicated to Frank Frazetta. I did have enough sense, even at that time, to ask the young director of publicity, by the way, do you have these paintings? Frank Frazetta's paintings now sell for 6 figures. And he said, yes. I said, would you be interested in selling one of them, maybe? He said, no. And nobody knows where those paintings are now. Frazetta kept most of his paintings, some of which have been sold off to very wealthy people and rock stars. But they're available. You can see them in books of his artwork, but they're not called Luana. One's called Jungle Girl, and in another book printing it's called something else. So I guess he wasn't thrilled about the film either. But it was an interesting experience. I had no film to novelize. I'm sorry she said that was the last question.
Thank you so much for coming. The bookstore has copies of Splinter in Mind's Eye out for sale in the lobby. This is for you.
Oh.
Thank you so much. I took a bottle of water out.